And welcome to another episode of Hank Unplugged. This is, it is the podcast, not the broadcast. It is what takes me out of the studio and right into the study. This is not as didactic, I suppose, leaning forward as it is conversational, and I'm really excited about podcasting. I didn't even know what podcasting was a couple of months ago. I certainly know what it is today. The first podcast I did with Frederica Matthews Green reached number 6 in its space. I mean, I was absolutely amazed. First out of the box, started in the thousands, of course, and got all the way to number 6. And then I did a podcast with Rod Dreher. His book, The Benedict Option, one of the most talked about books in the Christian world. So that's another one of these really exciting podcasts. But today I have a guy I want you to meet, someone that many people in the intellectual community are very familiar with. And I suppose people around the world are familiar with him in general. But there are probably a few people listening in like flies on the wall who don't know who Francis Beckwith is. And if you're one of those people, I want to introduce him as a philosopher who publishes and teaches in the area of politics, jurisprudence, religion, and ethics. He's a professor of philosophy and church-state studies, and he's the co-director of a program in philosophical studies of religion in the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University. By the way, one of my kids went to Baylor University. Most of you listening in that know anything about me know I have 12 kids, a lot of them in university at the same time. But one of them was a student of philosophy at Baylor University, my namesake, Hank Jr. Frank, of course, is a prolific author, and most recently he wrote a book called Taking Rights Seriously, Law, Politics, and the Reasonableness of Faith. This was a Cambridge University Press imprint, and I think it won the American Academy of Religion's 2016 Book Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion in the category of Constructive Reflective Studies. If that's not enough for you, way back in 1993, and this was the occasion for me to really get to know Frank Beckwith, he wrote a book called Politically Correct Death, Answering the Arguments for Abortion Rights. And I remember back in those years, I would go through that book and then through it again and then through it again. I dog-eared that book. I quoted from that book. That book was transformational because in that book, I started understanding how significant the life issue really is. Francis Schaeffer once said that this would be the watershed issue of our epoch of time, and he was certainly right about that. I'm talking to Frank as well because both of us made some significant changes in our lives, but we are both deeply committed to the concept of mere Christianity. Frank, I am so delighted to catch up with you. It's been a long time. We haven't talked. Got a letter from you when I converted to Orthodoxy, and it was very, very calming to me. You said, I've been through this. If you want to talk, let's have a conversation.
Well, it's great to be on, Hank. I can testify that I remember when you interviewed me for Politically Correct Death, and we were in the studio together, and I couldn't believe the color coordination that was in the text from notes you had taken and things you wanted to memorize. So I can testify you did, if it were a record album, we could say you bled it white, right?
Exactly. I mean, I love that book. And of course, you've written many books on the life issue. I mean, this is one of the issues that is a passion for you. Maybe we should start out by talking about this rudimentary issue. Here we live in an age of technology. When you wrote that book, we didn't have the kind of technology that we have today. I mean, people can now examine the evidence and know that a preborn child can actually see the face of a mother and have the cognitive awareness of whether that face is upside down or right side up. So we have great strides in technology, but the abortion issue isn't going away.
Yeah, to me, it's really the watershed issue of our age. I mean, there are many other issues that I think one can link to the abortion issue because they all deal with, to a certain extent, the question of who and what we are and whether we can know it. And the abortion issue raises even a deeper question, and that is, what sort of obligations that we have to those that are more vulnerable than us that we bring into existence? I mean, there's something godlike in the fact that human beings can actually, with God, participate in bringing other human beings into existence. And the idea that we can simply destroy those human beings as a matter of will without any justification is abhorrent. And it was that issue really profoundly affected my own sort of development as a Christian in the early 1980s. I was considered myself moderately pro-choice around 1984 or so, when I was in graduate school, and one of my fellow graduate students, who, believe it or not, was an atheist, shot down my pro-choice arguments. And it really surprised me how badly I was reasoning. And the other thing that was ironic about it is it was an unbeliever that actually was the one that helped change my mind. But as I began thinking more deeply about the issue, I began to see how it is connected to not only, a sort of obligation we have just to not harm others, but the obligation we have for those that we actually are responsible for bringing into existence, and what that tells us about just ethics in general. Many of the ways in which people reason about this issue always emphasize the struggle and the challenges that a pregnant woman may have. But if you think about it, the idea that our ethics should be driven solely by what we perceive as consequences for ourselves is, I think, ultimately undermining the kind of obligations that do require us to, in fact, move above and beyond what our desires are. I mean, this is what it means to be human.
I think about the experiences I've had, Frank. As you know, I have 12 children. And watching children being birthed is one of the greatest wonders imaginable. To see one human being come out of another human being is truly a miracle. I always watched it without any sense of the blood or the gore that some people get turned off by. It was always a beautiful mystery that was unfolding before my eyes. And, the more you see births take place, the more you know about what happens before a baby is born, the more passion you have about subjects like this.
Yeah, and the today, you mentioned earlier, the technology, we were able to peer into the womb and see things that even people 25, 30 years ago would have never thought imaginable. And yet, the idea that abortion is permissible still persists, and I think it has a lot to do with what people, how people think of their own nature as human persons. Usually, when we think about human beings, we think about usually ordinary adult human beings, and those are individuals that have consciousness, are able to reflect on life. And a lot of people, some philosophers will say, well, the unborn aren't like that, so therefore they're not truly persons. And I think it's a mistaken view of what we are. We're not at any one point of our existence wholly or completely perfected. I mean, and so if you think about the human being not as at any one point being complete, you can see that what the unborn human being is just simply one of us at an earlier stage of development, and that the maturation of that being is in fact a movement towards its perfection, but it still is what it is. It doesn't become anything different. It's just simply, in a way, it's a kind of unfolding, right, of the majesty of the image of God that we reflect. And yet, it still persists. The good thing is that I think that in terms of the general culture, people are much more inclined to the pro-life position than they were maybe 25, 30 years ago. And I think the technological advances, I think, have made that possible.
What about the anthropological problems that persist, though? I mean, if you look today at things that concern you, like gender fluidity or same-sex sexuality, all of these things are part and parcel of a misunderstanding or a misappreciation of the imago Dei, the image of God in humanity, and how we were created to be by an infinite, ineffable God who is knowable through his graces.
I think you're right. I mean, it's of the same kind of thinking, and let me explain what I mean by that. People today have a kind of a dualist view of the human person. Now, I want to be careful here because as Christians, we believe that in fact we have souls, and those souls can exist apart from our bodies. So I do believe that as Christians, we accept a kind of dualism in the sense that we believe that there's an immaterial aspect of our nature that does survive death. However, another important aspect of the Christian worldview is that we're going to be resurrected. Why? Because we are embodied souls by nature. We're not simply souls that happen to be tagged onto a body. Well, what does it have to do with abortion and gender issues? Well, insofar as those that want to sort of separate the intellectual part of the person from the physical part of the person can actually say things like, well, I feel like a woman trapped in a man's body. The assumption is that there is a physical kind of, that the human body is a kind of instrument of the mind and is not the real self, but the real self is purely the psychological. And tie that to the abortion issue, because the early fetus and embryo isn't psychologically mature, the assumption is it's not truly a person. So you have there's similar reasoning there. And I think the thing that has to be, I think, argued for is that human beings are not simply, our psychological selves. That is certainly an important aspect of us. It's the way we exercise our will. It's the way in which we think. But if we're ultimately, though, embodied, think about it. Even when we think, we have to actually perceive the world that's out there. We are beings that eat and drink and feel and love with our bodies. This is what we are. And so this is why, as Christians, we have to, I think, remember what the scriptures teach and then what the tradition teaches, namely that we're not simply this kind of Cartesian view of a thinking thing that happens to be attached to some bit of matter, that we are ensouled, and that what we are as human beings is something that is complex, but it's also reflects the way in which God has made us, and He made us not simply as minds attached to bodies, but in fact embodied souls.
I want to go back a lot of years in time with you right now, Frank. When I hear you talk, I can almost hear Bob and Gretchen Passantino. They had a great impact on your life, just as they had a great impact on my life. I remember when I became president of the Christian Research Institute, I didn't have the acumen that I needed, but there was a man and woman in the background, solely hidden from view, to the largest degree mentoring me, slowly teaching me. And that was something that absolutely radically changed the trajectory of my life and ministry. And I think we have that in common.
Yeah, I met Bob and Gretchen, 26 years ago, this past April. And for those who have never met the Passantinos, a lot of people haven't because, as you said, they were sort of behind the scenes. But I'll never forget the first time I went there to their home, which was this building adjacent to a Lutheran church in Newport, Costa Mesa area, and you've been there, the huge library of books. I remember I walked in. And I knocked on the door, and Gretchen answered with this big smile on her face, and she dressed like a hippie right out of Central Casting.
That's right.
And she gave me a big hug and told Bob, "Frank Beckwith is here," and proceeded to yell it to her son Paul to clean up and get ready for dinner. And then I just remember walking in and seeing the rows of overstuffed bookshelves. And I was there, I think, till 2 a.m., arguing with Bob and Gretchen and sometimes agreeing with them about a variety of theological issues. And the thing that I think really stood out about them was you never got the impression, even if you disagreed with them, that made any difference. They sort of enjoyed the whole aspect of learning together. The character, when I think of Bob Passantino, I think of Joe Pesci character in My Cousin Vinny. So if you can imagine. So that was what. So for those out there listening, this is the way it was. I mean, they were the brightest people I knew. And they had at that time no other than undergraduate education, everything that they were self-taught, but they were so well-read, so well-informed. And because they were so well-read and so well-informed, there was a kind of built-in humility to the way in which they conducted their lives. Even when they felt very strongly about something, they knew enough that they realized that even people who they thought were wrong may have a point. And so there was a wonderful aspect of visiting them. When my wife and I lived in Southern California, we spent many Sunday afternoons at their home, and it was a place. It was almost like like Boys Town. People were visiting there all day long, and Gretchen was cooking, and it was wonderful.
And you had to dodge the dogs, and the toughest thing for me was getting out of there. I mean, I remember the long hours. You have these conversations; they go on and on and on and on. They were very stimulating. But I'd look at my watch and think, I've got something I got to do early in the morning, and it's 1:00. I got to get out of here. And so you try to make your exit. Bob Passantino, he would walk you to the car.
Yeah.
And then he'd be talking to you, the car window still rolled up. He's still talking to you. Well, you don't want to be rude, so you roll down the car window, and he's talking to you. Then you start leaving. You start driving away very, very slowly, and Bob is keeping up with you as you're driving away. I mean, it was hilarious. But this this is a real expression from my perspective of authentic Christianity, because they had a passion for apologetics. They had a passion for always being ready to give an answer to anyone. And so they saw people who had platforms, people like you, people like me, and many, many others. I mean, the tribe can be multiplied many times over. But they saw people that had platforms, and they knew that by investing in those people, they were laying up for themselves treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not corrupt and where thieves do not break in and steal.
Yeah, they were amazing. I think about the times, and I'm sure you've had this too. I would call up Gretchen and I'd say, I have a question about something. I want to get your opinion. And then I hear her after about 10 minutes. She goes, "Bob, get on the other line." And Bob would get on the other line, and he would once in a while interrupt in that Bob-like voice. He would say, "Wait, let me just say this. Hey, you talk like this." And he would, and Gretchen would say, "Be quiet, Frank's speaking." And it was just. We'd be on the phone for sometimes 2 or 3 hours. But and I would sometimes get calls from Bob at all hours of the night, because I just had this idea. Amazing. They were an amazing couple, and I miss them dearly.
You know what's cool about all of this is that they were lifelong learners, and I think that is one of the values they instilled in me. Obviously, what I do as president of the Christian Research Institute and host of a daily Bible Answer Man broadcast is I have to be a lifelong learner, can never be static. And they instilled that value in me, continuously wanting to learn to become a sharper tool in the hands of the Holy Spirit. And I suppose if there's a message that we want to get out to people listening into this conversation, it is be a lifelong learner. And I bring this up, Frank, I suppose, because this in some way has to do with my conversion to Orthodoxy and your return to Catholicism. And I suppose maybe as prelude to that, we need to talk about what mere Christianity is, because one of the interesting things that happened when I converted to Orthodoxy after attending an Orthodox church for almost 3 years was that I immediately lost a lot of listenership. Reason being, I lost between 100 and 150 radio stations. Almost immediately. Of course, other doors have opened up, and so the ministry continues on as before. But a letter from NRB television president Troy Miller, for example, said, "Dear Hank, it has been brought to our attention through a number of our viewers, external media, and your program that you have converted to Eastern Orthodoxy. It has affected your public ministry and negatively affected our viewership." So as a result of my conversion, there was a slamming of doors all over the world. And I think that if you are a lifelong learner, oftentimes you are not willing to stay pat. And I say that maybe even in light of the fact that Gretchen Passantino died in 2014. I spoke at her funeral. And Bob died before that, and you recognize the brevity of life. And so ultimately what you do is for an audience of one.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole idea of lifelong learning, it's something that, being around them and seeing the way in which they just consumed so much literature. But the thing about it, though, is that they didn't read and they didn't learn just to argue for their own positions. I mean, that's certainly not wrong to do that. You want to learn how to defend your faith, but they also read in order for their own sort of intellectual and spiritual development, wherever that may lead. In fact, I guess I can share this now. When soon after I returned to the Catholic Church, Gretchen sent me an email, and I was blown away by it because we had never talked about Catholicism or anything of that sort, but she told me that her and Bob frequently would talk to each other about me and my wife, and one of the things that Bob apparently said to Gretchen was, "I wonder how long it's going to take for Frank to become Catholic." And this is what he said. This is what she said. This is the email. "Many years ago, Bob and I thought you would really enjoy the worship experience of Catholicism, and we were encouraged when you were attending that Anglican church in Newport Beach. I know he is pleased for you as well." Of course, he had since passed away when she wrote that. But the thing that the Passantinos instilled in me is the same as your experience. And as I've gotten older, I realize how much I don't know. Still, I was telling a couple of my students several months ago. I wish I was as sure of myself now as I was when I was 35. I think as a lifelong learner, you begin to realize that there's a limit. You can only read and do so much, and you have to do your best and pray, but you can't. There's a wide world out there of knowledge, and you can't know it all.
What is that quote? The larger the island of knowledge, the greater the shoreline of wonder, or the longer the shoreline of wonder. It's exactly what you just said, Frank. I mean, the more you know, the more you realize how little you know in the scope of what could be known. And I think to some degree that puts a big precedent for all of us, or at least should, in my estimation, on the historicity of the church. We ought to take seriously the communal or the collective memory of the church. I mean, not just as we talk about church fathers, but the grannies that passed on information to grannies to grannies. That has some significance. If you have, for example, a view, as Catholics do and as Orthodox do, in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and that view goes on through Luther, it seems to me you have to take that seriously.
I think you do. I think the other aspect of that historical continuity, and this is something as a Christian public intellectual, I think I feel liberated when I became Catholic in this sense. I no longer felt that I had to that I had to always have the meter running. And what I mean by that is that I'm part of a grand tradition, and that if I died tomorrow, the church would go on well without me. But when I was a leader in the evangelical world, I kind of felt I was really important. And I don't feel as important now, and it's great because I'm not part. It's just not me. And a few people. I'm part of something that's bigger than myself, and it's a lot larger. As G.K. Chesterton said, it's a lot larger it's a lot bigger when you're inside than when you're looking from the outside in. So, being part of that kind of is liberating. That doesn't mean you don't care about defending the faith or making a case for Christianity, but that's not the entirety of your life. You have to. You're permitted to, participate in the larger life of the church without always worrying about, the next article that's going to come out. So, at least for me, I mean, everyone's different, but my own experience, I found it liberating that there isn't that sort of pressure.
I remember when I was 14 years old, and you made me think of this as you were talking. I was. We had immigrated to the United States, first to Canada, then the United States, from Holland, and my parents and my sister and myself at that time were going back to Holland for a trip, and we stopped in London. And I'll never forget, as a 14-year-old boy, standing in St. Paul's Cathedral and thinking about the immensity of church history. I mean, I was looking up at a dome that I could barely see. It was so far away. It was so majestic. It was so grand. I was thinking about the relics that are built into the altars and the ossuaries and the tombs. And when you're in a church like that, you get a sense of history. And I think what you were communicating, our smallness in perspective of the grand panoply of history.
That's right. And it makes one less concerned about the present. And I want to make sure this is that it doesn't come across as we shouldn't care about the present. Obviously, we should, and we have many obligations as Christians to advance the common good and so forth. But what I'm saying is that when we look at what's happening in the world or things that may be happening in our respective churches that we don't like, there's a better historical perspective that we get when we see ourselves as just one part of a long narrative that's going to have a future and that's already has had a past, rather than seeing just that we have to reinvent the wheel every generation. I think that puts a different perspective on the calamities of our age. It doesn't. I don't want to diminish the importance of an active Christianity in the present. I certainly have done a lot of that myself. But what I'm suggesting is that it puts a perspective historically on our present age that we don't know what's going to be the world's going to be like 100 years from now. And think of so many of the things that are occurring today. We mentioned abortion already and transgender theory. Those sorts of beliefs that are in the public square didn't arise out of nothing. They arose from a cluster of ideas that were probably hundreds of years old, and now we're seeing them come to fruition. We don't know what role we're playing as Christians in terms of advancing the faith that we may be planting seeds that 100 years from now flourish in a way that is glorious and something that we would never have anticipated, but we don't know. And so I think being in that, looking at the history of the church in that way, there's less of what is the right term? We're less upset about the present.
I want to talk for just a few moments about what many evangelicals think of when they think of the Church of Rome. I remember many times while Chuck Colson was alive and he was working on ECT with Richard John Newhouse. And he would call me sometimes on the weekend, and he had really stepped in it, and the evangelicals were very, very upset because he wanted to work with Catholics on common cause issues. And this became a great stir. And so he'd call me, and we'd kind of talk it out. Of course, with Chuck, he was a little different. He'd always call me, Frank, and then he'd ask me a question, he'd answer the question, he'd ask me another question, he'd answer the question, he'd ask me one more question, he'd answer the question. That would go on for a while, and then he'd thank me for really clearing up his mind. Chuck was a hoot, but he's a true Christian statesman. But, it gave me a sense of some of the vitriol that can come out when you mention Roman Catholicism. In fact, I want to read you something and have you comment. This is something that I wrote in my book, The Apocalypse Code. This was while Tim LaHaye was alive. He, of course, had indicated that he studied biblical prophecy for more than 50 years. And as such, he was absolutely certain that the mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth, covered with blasphemous names, is none other than the Roman Catholic Church of the 21st century. The Church of Rome, he said, is doctrinally a mixture of Babylonian paganism and Christianity, a far cry from the faith once for all entrusted to the saints. And then he went on to incriminate the Roman Catholic Church in the most pejorative terms imaginable: pseudo-Christian, false religion, mother of idolatry, Nimrod. And in his view, Rome is not the only form of Babylonian mysticism, but merely the one that has infiltrated Christianity, and after the rapture, their leaders, the leaders that remain, will bring all the Babylonian-based religions together with one global idolatrous religion. Now, when you read that in popular literature, and I've heard Tim LaHaye say this when he was alive, and I've heard many other evangelicals quote things that are very similar about Roman Catholicism. Now you have someone like Frank Beckwith, who returns to Roman Catholicism. You were the president of ETS, and you can imagine the thoughts in the minds of many people that are listening to this kind of rhetoric.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, it is happening before our very eyes.
Yeah. I got a lot of emails about that. In fact, my wife, she got, I don't know how this person got my wife's email, but wrote my wife and said that you and your husband have joined the whore of Babylon. And I had to tell my wife was so upset, and I said, don't respond. And so she didn't. But yeah, I mean, I think Tim LaHaye in many ways was a good guy. I think I admired his courage for his stance on a lot of the cultural issues. But like many people, in evangelicalism, he was deeply influenced by a book that had come out in I think the 1960s or 70s. It may be older, but that's when I bought it. It was called Babylon Mystery Religion.
Yeah.
And it became a kind of bestseller in the evangelical world. And the thesis is that Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, is a sort of combination of Christianity and the appropriation of Babylonian religious practices. And the book is, it's historically awful. It's not accurate. The practices that are singled out are actually practices that are found in Eastern Orthodoxy. The view of the Eucharist, the understanding of liturgy, and so forth. And what the author of the book, I think, doesn't understand is that these practices are very deep in Christian history. Forget his name, author, Robert Wilkin. Robert Wilkin at University of Virginia published a book several years ago about the early Christian church. And this is actually something that really influenced my return to Catholicism. The thing that Wilkin argues in the book is that if you go back to the very earliest liturgies that we have records of in the second century, you have things like prayers to the saints and a practice of the Eucharist that clearly implies a kind of Eucharistic realism. And this is found not only in the West, but also in the Eastern churches as well. And so, I think you have folks like LaHaye who are, I think, well-meaning Christians trying to persuade people to come to Christ. But I think at the end of the day, they don't have a very good sense of Christian history, and they just believed these books.
You know what I like about the way you answer that question and the way you're dialoguing with me on that particular issue is I don't hear the vitriol in return. It's not as though, well, this guy is the worst person that ever walked the face of the earth because he said that particular thing about the Roman Catholic Church. Instead, what you're doing is you're highlighting the positive aspects of his life and the contribution that he made while he was still living. And I think to some degree, all of that is very, very necessary in answer to the Lord's high priestly prayer that we all may be as one, not one in the sense of compromising what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity or an essentials unity, non-essentials liberty, all things charity, but one standing shoulder to shoulder in the battle for life and truth, not finding ways to bifurcate or trifurcate, but rather finding ways by which we can find commonality so that together we can have an impact, particularly in this epoch of time when unity among Christians is desperately needed.
That's right. The thing that, in fact, the thing that really, and I think having been on both sides has been really helpful to me. That is, as somebody that has written things critical of other faiths, both as an evangelical and a Catholic, and getting to know people on both sides, and I think also just the maturity that comes with age. The thing that you begin to realize is that in some ways you kind of admire people that sort of stand up for their beliefs. So Tim LaHaye wrote those things, and they're kind of nasty to be sure. But in a way, I kind of would rather live in a world where people actually take theology seriously, and they're able to make these distinctions. So LaHaye, for all the rhetoric against Catholicism that you read from that work, he worked closely with Catholics in Washington, D.C. for the cause of the pro-life position. So, I think the fact that people take theology seriously, I think is a good thing, and in fact, people are complicated. They can exhibit certain virtues in terms of the way in which they conduct their lives, but they may not actually exhibit intellectual virtues in some areas. This is just the way that we are as human beings. So, but I do think you're right. We have to learn how to work together, especially since we share so much in terms of our moral beliefs, our views about the family, our views about the relationship between the church and the wider culture. These are things that Christians virtually all share, and if we don't if we don't stand together, they'll hang us separately, right?
Yeah, one of the things, though, that a lot of evangelicals would tell you is a deal breaker is, and that's both for you and me, is that we've both bought into systems of belief that are crass systems of work righteousness, and therefore we're giving up an essential to historic Christian faith. Think that through with me.
Yeah, I think one of the misunderstandings I think that a lot of Protestants have about Catholic and Orthodox views of grace is that they have I think this is maybe it's not the best way to explain it, but they have a kind of zero-sum game view of how human beings and God work together for our own sanctification. So for them, it's like it's either grace or me. But the Catholic, and correct me if I don't want to misrepresent the Orthodox view, but they're very similar in this sense that grace plays a role in healing the soul, which has a particular nature, and that the soul has a will. And so when we exercise our will as a consequence of God's grace working through us, in a mysterious way, it's us acting, but God gets all the credit. And because God is all powerful, and He's also not a thing in the universe in the sense that, it's either God acting or us acting. It's a cooperation, but yet it's still Him. And the example I've used with some of my evangelical friends is this. I've said, now, you guys believe, as we believe, as Catholics believe, is that the Bible is God's Word. Yes. But you also believe Paul wrote Romans. How can you say Paul wrote Romans and yet it's God's Word? and I said, now you understand that what you're saying is that Paul wrote Romans and yet is 100% God's Word. If you can understand that, then you can understand the traditional view of the relationship between grace and works in the pre-Reformation Christian tradition. It isn't that we're doing things to please God. We are in fact accepting the grace so that we can in fact act in charity for the sake of reflecting His grace and for our own transformation. And it is mysterious, but that's okay. In fact, as I've said to a couple of my grad students several months ago, I don't want to believe in a God I can understand. There's something about trying to figure everything out, and I think again, there's nothing wrong with that in principle. But I do think that we have to allow for the possibility that we can't figure everything out, and we just have to accept that this is what we've been taught, and that's the role that God's grace plays in our lives.
Yeah, that's what I recall C.S. Lewis saying, that the simplest religions are the made-up religions. And from a personal standpoint, Frank, I mean, that was one of the great attractions for me with respect to orthodoxy, a recognition that I can live in the land of antinomy, that I can accept things that are beyond my ken, which is to say that I can apprehend things like the Trinity.
Yeah.
I can apprehend the incarnation of Jesus Christ. I can apprehend the Eucharist, but I can't comprehend any of them. They're beyond my ability to comprehend. Yeah. And I think this is one of the great things, maybe a point that we ought to make as we're doing this podcast, is that God is ineffable. He is unknowable in his essence. He's obviously knowable in his graces. And what I think is so important is that without the church, you can't live out the Christian life, because it is within the context of the church that you partake of the graces of God, whereby you are going through a process of theosis and this whole idea of deification. And by the way, I just read a compilation of essays. It was all written by Catholics on theosis that I thought was the most brilliant of anything that I had read on the subject. But anyway, without getting into the weeds here, I mean, the thing that I love about Orthodoxy and that I value within Roman Catholicism is maybe what was called the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the mystery that causes us to tremble and yet attracts us. I mean, how can we possibly explain how Christ can be one person with two natures? And likewise, how can we really understand how Christ can really be present in the elements?
Yeah, there's one other thing that along the same lines that drew me back to the Catholic Church, and perhaps something similar with your own journey to Orthodoxy, was I always had a difficult time with post-baptismal sin. What do I do with? I mean, I want to be good. But on the other hand, though, I'm told that I don't have to be good. I just have to, have a certain set of beliefs. And that just wasn't satisfying to me. And so the idea that the grace of God transforms me, and you mentioned the term theosis, it's actually something mentioned in the Catholic Catechism, in the section on justification. And that to me was, it was liberating. So when I go to confession, I don't know do you guys call it confession as well, or?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a different take on confession in Orthodoxy, but there is confession as a rite, yes.
And it's something that, like, I feel, unburdened in a way that I never sensed when I was apart from the church. And so, I mean, I think of it this way, if you've probably been to or seen a Billy Graham crusade where, a lot of people walk down for the altar call. It turns out about a third of those people are backslidden Christians. And so it seems that there's an intuitive part of us that when we fall away, we want to be reconciled back to the church. And I think that's manifested in that kind of activity at crusades or even at church services. You may be at a Protestant church where an altar call, the pastor leads an altar call, and guess who walks down? Number of people that identify as Christians. Why? They feel separated and they need to be reconciled to the church. That's all that the confession does. And it for me, that was one of the things that really drew me back as well.
I mean, you're talking about the difference, I think, between, faith is transactional. Oftentimes the way the Christian faith is posited is, pray this prayer and you get a get out of jail free card. Pray this prayer and you're assured of going to heaven. And I think the Christian faith is much richer than that. It is not just about a changed life. It's about an exchanged life. It's about the life of Christ within. We can live life now that is life to the full by partaking of the graces which are offered to us in the spiritual gymnasium that we oftentimes talk about as the church.
That's right. Yeah, the thing that I think a lot of people, don't understand about the draw that of both Orthodoxy and Catholicism to a lot of evangelicals is that they tend to, I think, over-intellectualize it. And what I mean by that is that instead of trying to understand both traditions on their own terms, is an attempt to sort of translate it to the language of sort of contemporary evangelical Protestantism. And I don't think you can do that. You can't take, for example, the distinctions that you find in some writers in the evangelical world between faith and works and find anything parallel to that in either Orthodoxy or Catholicism, because they're working with an entirely different understanding of those categories that they trace back to the very, very early church. And so, I mean, I think that's why I think the best way to explain this stuff, and I think you've done a great job of doing that, Hank, is sort of, kind of share your own story and explain that that the way in which a lot of evangelicals think of Catholicism and Orthodoxy really can't be grasped until it's like learning a new language. There are some nuances of words and terms that you can't really understand until you sort of are practicing it, right? And you're among those that are in fact engaging in that community. And I think it's the same thing with these theological differences.
Kind of interesting, when I converted to Orthodoxy, my whole world blew apart in many different ways, not only because of the loss of so many radio outlets and being kicked off of NRB television, and the list goes on and on. But shortly thereafter, I found out that I had mantle cell lymphoma, and so at the same time, I'm battling a disease. But what was really interesting to me in all of that was that while there was vitriol, I mean, there was a lot of postings on the internet, Bible Answer Man walks away from the Christian faith, and Bible Answer Man apostatizes, and all of these kinds of things. But I would tell you that some of the most fantastic notes of encouragement that I got was from past presidents, or presidents, as it were, of the Southern Baptist Convention, of people throughout evangelicalism that were saying to me, look, I don't know Orthodoxy, but I know you, I trust you, I know that you have not gone off half-cocked, I want to learn more. And I suppose you and I both share in common the appreciation we have for people like that.
Oh, I have so many of these notes. And I encourage you, Hank, to keep every single one of them. I have a folder on my hard drive called all about I collected everything. I kept every single email, and I really can't mention the names of some people. Some of them have since passed away, but I remember sitting in my office weeping at the notes, including one from you that I sent back to you a couple of weeks ago, saying, you sent me this 10 years ago, I send it back. And I got emails from people. I had one fellow, a friend of mine at a very prominent evangelical seminary, saying, I don't agree with what you did, but you're still a brother in Christ, and I look forward to working with you. And in general, I got some of the nasty ones as well, but I got a lot of really nice ones, and I don't think it's affected I know it's affected none of my friendships. I'm still very good friends with many people who teach at evangelical schools throughout the United States, and I've actually spoken, I think, since 2007. I think I've spoken 5 times at the Evangelical Theological Society. I've been invited to be on panels, and I've actually submitted papers, and they've been accepted. And you can't, 25, 30 years of friendships, you can't change overnight. And but yeah, you should keep all those, because I every once in a while I when I'm feeling a little down or something like that, I go back and I read some of those emails, and they sort of bring back, I think, some good memories about that time.
Yeah, I was totally shocked when you sent me back the email that I had sent you, because I had actually forgotten that I had written it. Yeah,
it is remarkable. As you said, the number of people, and some of them the people I don't even know I didn't even know knew me, who knew of me. And in fact, I had Walter Hooper, the guy that is in charge of C.S. Lewis's I think his literary works. I don't know his exact role in Lewis's inheritance, but he wrote me this lovely note. And I've known of Walter Hooper for years, and I didn't even know he knew who I was. So, it's amazing.
I'm having this amazing conversation with Frank Beckwith. One of the things I promised to do on Hank Unplugged is bring you the brightest and most interesting people in the world, and I've certainly followed through on doing that by having Frank Beckwith on this podcast. He is one of the brightest lights in the Christian world. In fact, the note you were talking about, I have in front of me where I write, "Dear Frank and Frankie," I love your wife's name. "Dear Frank and Frankie, just a note to let you know that you're my thoughts and prayers. This is upon your conversion, re-entering the Roman Catholic Church. You have always been a clear thinker, a man of deep conviction, a person of principle. I do not suppose that has suddenly changed. I continue to appreciate your friendship and your faithfulness. Blessings, Hank." And then you wrote me back, "I feel the same about you when it comes to your move to Orthodoxy." What I want to go to in this vein is some commentary on where we are right now, June 21st century, maybe even an epoch of time that Gretchen could not have imagined, or certainly that Bob could not have imagined. Sometimes we use that unfortunate metaphor of a slippery slope, but it seems to apply to the situation we're in terms of the culture wars. As Christians, we're living in a modern liberal democracy. We have rights, but also responsibilities. We have the responsibility to promote righteousness and justice and equity and to influence the public square in the service of the good. So my question is, where does a Christian in today's legal and culture climate begin to do that?
That's a very difficult question, and you mentioned earlier Rod Dreher and his book, The Benedict Option. I, like yourself, I'm a big fan of that work. I think the lesson of that book is that we have to work now while it is day, for tomorrow no man may work. And that, what I mean by that is that we have to shore up our own institutions and protect them. And that includes universities, institutes such as CRI, churches. We've seen over the past decade or so liberalism itself transform. The liberalism that you and I grew up with was a liberalism of tolerance, one that said that people should be free to live their own lives and build their own institutions and influence the public square insofar as that is constitutionally permissible. But what has happened today is we have like a hegemonic liberalism that is not satisfied with just, let's say, getting gay marriage, but wants to make sure that there are no institutions that exist that promote the traditional Christian understanding of the nature of marriage and the nature of the family. And they will use our public governmental institutions to make sure that that occurs. So my own university, Baylor University, I have no doubt if in the near future may very well be challenged by the Department of Education if they don't change its views on the nature of human sexuality. I think right now, what we have to care most about is shoring up our own institutions, making sure there are legal protections in place, and also, I think, catechizing our own people, but just not telling them what they should believe, but to give them the full-orbed, rich understanding of why we believe these things. And that means not just simply explaining the scriptural justification. That is certainly vital and essential, but also explaining why this is integral to the Christian faith and why it's always been embraced since the beginning of the church. So I think we're at a time where those issues, you mentioned the culture war issues, but most especially issues on human sexuality, are front line and center, and we have to be prepared for attacks upon our institutions. People aren't going to... Today, those that disagree with the church aren't satisfied with leaving us alone. They don't want us to actually exist in terms of holding those views, and we have to be ready for that. And I'm not sure we really are. I think we were given a kind of temporary reprieve with what happened in November of 2016, but I'm not sure Christians are doing the best right now to make sure that in the long run we're going to have a chance.
You were talking about the book, The Benedict Option. Of course, it's something I talked to Rod Durer about in my podcast with him. One of the comments he made was that though Donald Trump won the presidency in part with the strong support of Catholics and evangelicals, the idea that someone as robustly vulgar and fiercely combative and morally compromised as Trump will be an avatar for the restoration of Christian morality and social unity, he said was beyond delusional, that he was not the solution to the problem of America's cultural decline, but a symptom of it. What's interesting, though, and you alluded to this, is that it seems to me, on the one hand, we dodged a bullet in terms of religious liberties. On the other hand, we have to make a distinction between what happens at the ballot box and what happens in terms of how culture is shaped by the environmental institutions or the educational institutions or the entertainment institutions and the like.
That's right. I mean, the thing that I think Christians have to be concerned about is the administrative state. And what I mean by that is those alphabet agencies that are in the federal government that really have a lot of power to influence and shape allegedly independent institutions such as universities and colleges and other nonprofit organizations. And that's when I was referring to a temporary reprieve. What I was suggesting that we know that if Hillary Clinton had won, she would have probably gone after through her administrative agencies these private institutions. So we have a temporary reprieve in that regard. But I think, Rod, I mean, I wasn't a big supporter of the president, but I am delighted that he's picked certain people of the federal bench that may stave off, at least for the time being, the sort of judicial interference with the assistance of administrative agencies that would go after the church.
Maybe there's an easy way for you to explain this to people listening into our conversation. I suppose the question I'm asking is the question that Francis Schaeffer asked: how then shall we live? I mean, we're in an interesting time in human history. Jesus said that you are the light of the world. He said you are salt, and if the salt loses its saltiness, how's it going to be made salty again? So we have to look at ourselves, meaning genuine, authentic Christians, as the leavening force in society. And so often, Frank, I say to people, look, the problem is not the culture. I mean, pagans are going to exercise their job description. What else would they do? The real problem is Christians not exercising their job description, and as a result, the culture goes in a bad direction. Talk to Christians about what we ought to be doing so that we can once again become a leavening force in the world.
I think we have to, first off, we have to live as Christians, and that means setting an example. And we also have to be willing to suffer. Years ago, Campus Crusade had this, the four spiritual laws, and it would begin with, Jesus loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. And that's true to a certain extent. But I think the thing that we have to tell people is that part of that wonderful plan may very well mean having to suffer for your faith. And that means that if in fact you're in a position, your institution is in a position to maybe lose its tax-exempt status, if it, let's say, violates some administrative agency rule, you may have to suffer. And I think one of the other things that Francis Schaeffer mentioned, and I think it might have been in the Christian Manifesto, he says, or The Great Evangelical Disaster, I forget which book, he says that in the future, Christians may be tempted to trade their liberty for peace and prosperity. And I'm afraid that the temptation is very much there now. I mean, I see it on a lot of the cultural issues. My friends on Facebook, sort of shifting their views because they're afraid. They're afraid of being called names. They're afraid of being marginalized. So I think we have to reintroduce ourselves to the whole history of martyrdom. I'm not saying that that's going to happen. What I mean by martyrdom is not simply dying for your faith, literally, but also being a witness and be willing to suffer for the faith. And if you look at the history of the church, that's when it excelled the most. So we have to be willing to do that. And I don't think there's any one particular program or policy that's going to change things. I think it also has to come from the pulpit. This understanding that sometimes living the Christian faith, especially in a culture that is hostile to it, will mean that you will suffer.
Maybe even on a personal level, going through chemotherapy now and blood transfusions and ultimately having to have a bone marrow transplant. You think about all of that and you think on the one hand, if only I can touch the hem of his garment and feel the healing virtue flow into my body and be instantly healed. On the other hand, I oftentimes think it is in suffering that we are pruned, that we come to a true valuation of things, and then we're poured out in new and better fashion. We so often want to eliminate the suffering, but it is through suffering, it is through the dark threads that oftentimes the hand of God shapes our lives the most.
That's right. And I've never been through what you've been through, but I've been through personal turmoil, and it's sometimes it's very, very difficult. When I first arrived at Baylor 14 years ago, there were folks that didn't want me on the faculty because of my views on church and state, and it was horrible. It became a sort of national story, and I think back to those times. I don't think I'd want it differently, and here's why. I grew up. During that time, it forced me. The Lord used that to kind of build a sense of patience in me, and also knowing when I should not speak. And those sorts of, there are certain virtues that don't really arise unless you go through some sort of adversity. But you mentioned also the fact that it's also not only transformative in terms of, let's say, your own virtue, but also in terms of how close you grow to Christ. Because when we suffer with Him, and He suffered for us, and it's almost an honor to be able to participate in His sufferings. And that's the way a lot of people in the early church thought when they were under far greater persecution than any one of us in the United States will face today. So I think we have to remind ourselves of all those passages in the Scripture that talk about suffering with Christ. He who lives godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution, right? That's part of the deal.
Yeah, and part of the deal, as far as I'm concerned, was my own disillusionment with sort of the consumerism. Turn on to Jesus Christ, so you're going to have a better business. Turn on to Jesus Christ, you're going to have to find a prettier girlfriend. I mean, where Christ becomes a means to an end as opposed to being the end. And this is so different from what you were alluding to. The Apostle Paul said, I want to know Him and the fellowship of His sufferings, becoming like Him in His death, and so somehow or other to attain to the resurrection of the dead. Maybe we can end this discussion because we could go on forever, but let's talk for a minute as we kind of conclude our dialogue today about having an eternal perspective. I mean, you're, I think, 10 years younger than I am. I was born in 1950. I think you were born in 1960, if I recall. Right. So there's a 10-year span, but I'm now in my, going to be 67 this year. And again, there looks very, very likely that I got a tall mountain to climb, but on the other side of that, I'll go into complete remission and continue on with my ministry. But there's a sense in which I can stare my own mortality in the face and then not really care what people say. There's this anecdote that I heard, I guess I read it in John Climacus, John of the Ladder, where he tells this story about these robbers going out to rob a bank or going out to rob something. And they know that the eyes of God are upon them, and suddenly they hear the barking of dogs, and they turn and run. They no longer carry out their robbery. The point being is they were not scared of the eyes of God. They were scared away by barking dogs. And so often I think about this. I think ultimately it's not going to be the approval of men that matters. What is really going to matter is standing before our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and He saying, "Well done, good and faithful servant."
Yeah, and I think you mentioned, you asked me earlier about our present moment and what the church can do, and what you just said actually is something else that I think that the church, and here I mean Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox, all of us, is that we have to reinstill in our own people the idea that that we should be doing things to please God and not the world. And obviously it's easier said than done. But one way that I have found helpful in my own journey is to read from the great saints in the history of the church about their own travails and sufferings and reading their works, and to stay away from a lot of contemporary stuff. My wife and I cut the cable 2 years ago, and there's something that, by reading people and dedicating yourself to prayer and in obviously in our case the sacraments and to devotional reading, that helps instill that perspective, right? It's not something you can sort of switch on and off. It's part of the consequence of living a life with particular disciplines. And I think that's something that we have to remind ourselves, that we are creatures of habit. That's why virtue comes from the Latin for habitus, to habit. That is, that it has to do with the way in which we conduct our lives. And so if you always are thinking about what other people think, that's going to be the most important thing to you. And so I think, I found in my own journey to sort of stay away as much as possible from what the everything that's happening at every moment on the internet, and reading and incorporating and appropriating in my own life those things, those writings that by people that in fact have in some way lived saintly lives.
It's kind of interesting when you bring up the internet, in that regard. There's a plasticity of the brain that is deeply impacted by the internet in a negative way. And I think the inverse of that would be precisely what you're talking about. We need to get back to reading, to seeing these great stories of the martyrs that have gone on before us so that we can emulate their lives.
That's right. One of the problems with the modern age is that we put a premium on the present as sort of the measure of all reality. So you get people, one of the comments that you sometimes get if you are, let's say, offering a Christian understanding of a particular social issue, people say, well, it's the 21st century, right? As if just looking at the calendar can determine what's right or wrong. And that kind of thinking is so instilled and so much a part of our sort of cultural infrastructure. That is, all that matters is what people believe right now. And this is why I think losing that understanding of that we're part of an inherited tradition is deadly to the church. And this is why, if you look at any sort of a revolution in any country where there's an attempt to kind of bring in a very strong secularism, whether it's the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, what's the thing that they go after? They go after those institutions that are doing the job of passing on the cultural traditions. And so when Christians start acting like that, we're committing ecclesial suicide. We're sort of doing the work of the people who are enemies of the church. And so I think part of our project has to be that kind of a pushing back against this sort of modern understanding.
You can imagine that converting to Orthodoxy, I get a lot of questions on the Bible Answer Man broadcast and other venues on the distinction between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, or the distinction between the Eastern and the Western Church. And oftentimes I think the temptation is to try to lay out all of these distinctions and leave the conversation at that, as opposed to looking at the greater picture. And one of the things I've tried to do, particularly of late, is to point out the contributions that the Roman Catholic Church is making around the world in terms of aid to the needy, giving the piece of bread and the cup of water in the name of Jesus Christ. The relief organizational work done by Roman Catholics is second to none. Then I think about people like yourself, and there are many others like you, Jay Richards. I mean, the list can go on. Roman Catholics that are some of the brightest, keenest thinkers of our day. I think of some of the books that I've read. I mentioned earlier that I was reading a compilation of papers on theosis, and that compilation was called Called to be Children of God, the Catholic Theology of Human Deification. Some of the richest material from some of the finest thinkers on the planet. So maybe you have a comment on this, but for me, one of the things that I think we often ought to try to resist is going to, well, let's point out where the differences are and opt for my side of the equation, the Eastern Church as opposed to the Western Church, without really pointing out the significance of what the Roman Catholic Church is doing around the world. And neither one of us thinks, at least I'm sure you don't think, and I don't think, that Orthodoxy is a panacea, nor do you think Roman Catholicism is a panacea. But we have to point out, instead of going to the differences, we have to point out what is happening as a result of Catholic thinking and what would happen if that were eliminated from our world today.
Yeah, one of the things that John Paul II said was that the church has two lungs and it needs to breathe with both. And of course, the lungs were the East and the West. So I think that, I think that there's a lot that we can learn from each other. And I know from my own journey, some of the individuals that drew me back to Catholicism were academics and other, including John Paul II, their writings on a lot of these contested questions in our public square. And in fact, I tell the story in my book, Return to Rome. It was, I think, 1998. I had just read for the first time John Paul II's encyclical Evangelium Vitae, which is the Gospel of Life, and Fide et Ratio, the faith and reason. And I called up J.P. Moreland at Biola University, who's a friend of both of us, and I called J.P. and I said, and this is again 1998, this is 9 years before I returned to the Catholic Church, and I read a quote from Fide et Ratio, and I said, J.P., guess who this is? And he reeled off a bunch of names. He said, Alvin Plantinga, Richard Swinburne, who are well-known Christian philosophers. I said, no, it's the Pope. And J.P. paused for a moment. He goes, wow, I guess he's one of us. So, there was something. In fact, I remember then J.P., years later, after he became Catholic, wanted to read more about this. And he says he was blown away. He says, I can't believe there's so much in this encyclical that I agree with. He goes, this is, and he said, some of what, he goes, I don't know how much Dallas Willard knew about John Paul II, but they're very close. And it turned out that John Paul II in philosophy was influenced by phenomenology, whose great thinker was a guy named Husserl, and Dallas Willard was a student of Husserl's. And so, of course, Dallas Willard was a great evangelical philosopher at USC, and so small world, you know. But yeah, that JP story. I mean, it really, you know, when I reflected back when I was working on the book, I tried to, you know, think of times where, you know, things that didn't seem such a big deal at the time. Now looking back, yeah, that's interesting.
You know, what's really interesting is the title of your book. I mean, not the title as much as the subtitle, A Return to Rome, and then the subtitle, Confessions of an Evangelical Catholic. A lot of people would say that's got to be an oxymoron.
Yeah, you know, I call myself an evangelical Catholic because I believe in the good news. I believe in the gospel. I believe in evangelism. But I'm also a Catholic. I you know, identify as a member of the Roman Catholic Church, and that's tradition that I'm in. And I mean, one of the things I end the book, and I make a case for this in the last chapter, and I end the book by pointing out all the different sorts of evangelicals that are out there. I mean, if you look at, for example, the Evangelical Theological Society, you have people who are part of ETS who are Calvinists, who are Arminians, who identify as Wesleyans, who identify as Anglicans. And between those different views, I mean, there's wide disagreement, right? I mean, it seems to me that why can't you be an evangelical Catholic? You know, or a Catholic evangelical. I don't know which one is the right adjective, but so yeah. I mean, I think anyone who believes in sharing the gospel and seeking converts for Christ is in a sense an evangelical. I mean, I know historically the word evangelical is linked to a particular historical moment in both the U.S. and Europe, but I think today, you know, given the way in which the culture has changed, I think the term evangelical Catholic is perfectly reasonable and makes sense, especially for those of us who, you know, spent a good part of our lives as evangelicals. We enter, you enter Orthodoxy and I enter Catholicism with having been formed by that tradition, and I think we bring the best of that to our respective traditions. So as someone who lived as an evangelical for quite some time, I'm not like your typical cradle Catholic, and you are probably not like your typical cradle Orthodox, and that's a good thing. I think there are many gifts and many talents that evangelicals have that I think both Orthodox and Catholics can in fact appropriate, and still without compromising their traditions.
Yeah, this conversation is starting to remind me of being with Bob and Gretchen Passantino in Southern California, sitting on the couch, and the conversation just keeps going on, and it goes on and goes on. Pretty soon it's 1 or 2 in the morning. I'm not going to let that happen because I've got a lot of people listening in. But I tell you, it's just fascinating having this discussion with you and catching up with you. I've always appreciated you as an intellect, but I love you as a brother in the Lord, as someone that deeply cares about living out the Christian life and making an impact while there's yet time.
Oh, thank you, Hank. I'm very much, you're very much in our prayers. I love you, brother. You're a good man, and I hope we can have this conversation again years from now.
Well, me too, and I hope you give my best to Frankie. I still remember her coming to the Christian Research Institute. She was a delight.
Yeah, she's terrific.
Well, Frank, thanks so much for enriching us with this podcast. It was a wonderful conversation. I'm sure people listening into this edition of Hank Unplugged have been greatly blessed but stretched as well. God bless you, dear brother.
You too. Thank you, Hank.
You got it. And this, again, is another episode of Hank Unplugged. Conversations with some of the clearest thinkers, some of the brightest minds. And what we're trying to do is not make this sort of a question and answer interview format, but more of a conversation. where the personality, you certainly saw the personality of Frank Beckwith come out. He's an incredibly bright guy, but he's a personality as well, and a blast to be around. It's been years since I got to hang out with him, so this was fun for me. Hope it was fun for you as well. Stay tuned for the next edition of Hank Unplugged. You can subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Make sure that you share, make sure that you rate, review, and make sure that you subscribe. Thanks for tuning in. Look forward to the next episode of Hank Unplugged.